Get comfortable and let the room settle around you. Tonight we're going to a farm in north central Kansas, to a gravel road where the wheat fields run all the way to the sky and the porch light is the brightest thing for miles. This is a story about the minute a tornado took a barn and the weekend a county put it back. There is no villain here. Weather doesn't make plans, and kindness doesn't need an enemy before it knows what to do. So pull the blanket a little higher and stay as long as you'd like, because the part worth waiting for comes after the storm, when 100 people sign their names somewhere rain will never wash them away. Howard Peterson was 78 that spring, and his wife June was 76. They had lived on the same 160 acres since the summer they married, though the farmhouse had changed color 3 times, and the kitchen had moved once after a pipe froze behind the north wall. Howard claimed the land was flatter now than it had been when he bought it, which June said was what happened when a man spent 54 years wearing down the same view. They weren't large farmers anymore. They leased most of the fields to a younger neighbor named Caleb Foster, kept 6 gentle cows, 2 barn cats, and a garden June planted too big every year on purpose. Howard still rose before 6 because his body hadn't received the news about retirement, and June still packed him a thermos even when the farthest he planned to travel was the machine shed. Their barn stood west of the house, weathered red under a silver roof. Howard's father and uncles had raised it in 1968 after the first one burned from a lightning strike, and Howard, 20 years old then, had driven nearly every nail in the hayloft. On the inside of the main door, at shoulder height, his father had written the date in carpenter's pencil and signed his initials. Howard had never painted over it. He had painted around it 6 times. The weather radio began talking before lunch on the last Thursday in May. A warm front had been sitting over the county since morning, making the air feel thick enough to hold, and by 3 the western sky had turned the color of a bruised plum. June stood at the kitchen sink, watching cottonwood leaves show their pale undersides. Howard came through the mudroom and said, "Cellar." He didn't raise his voice. He took the radio, the flashlight, June's medication box, and the old quilt they kept folded by the basement door. June called the cats even though she knew better, then let herself be steered downstairs while the siren in town began its long, rising cry. Their storm cellar was the poured concrete room beneath the pantry, reached by 12 steep steps. It smelled of cool earth, canned peaches, and the faint metallic damp that never quite left the pipes. Howard shut the door above them, and the afternoon became the yellow beam of a flashlight and a battery radio speaking too quickly. At first there was rain. Then hail struck the house in fistfuls, hard enough that June could hear individual stones bounce down the cellar steps. The power went out, the sump pump stopped, and Howard reached across the dark until he found her hand. The tornado arrived as pressure before sound. June's ears closed. A jar lid clicked on the shelf, then another, and the whole house seemed to inhale over them. After that came the roar people always compare to a train, though Howard would later say it sounded more like every piece of farm equipment he'd ever owned running inside a steel grain bin. The cellar door pulled against its latch. Dust sifted down in the flashlight beam, and somewhere above them, glass broke in a quick, bright sequence. June counted Howard's knuckles with her thumb. 1, 2, 3, 4. She started again and kept counting until the roar moved east and became only rain. They waited because waiting is part of surviving. Howard wanted to go up at once, but June kept hold of his sleeve while the radio warned of another circulation behind the first. For 11 minutes they sat without speaking, listening to water drip into a bucket in the dark. When they climbed out, the kitchen was still there. That was the first mercy. Half the windows were gone, rain had blown across the linoleum, and a cottonwood branch lay through the breakfast nook, but the walls were standing and the roof remained over most of them. Then Howard stepped onto the porch and looked west. The barn was gone. Not damaged. Gone in the bewildering way only a tornado can make a large, familiar thing disappear. The concrete footings remained, and part of one wall lay flat in the wheat, but the roof was nowhere Howard could see. Fence posts had been pulled from the ground. The stock tank sat upside down against the hedge, and pink insulation hung in the branches like wet party streamers. One of the cows stood in the road, unharmed and deeply offended. Two others had pushed into the low draw before the storm and were bellowing from the mud. Howard found all six by dark. June found one barn cat under the porch and the second the next morning in the cab of a truck with no windshield. Nobody died on that road. No house was carried off its foundation. The tornado had traveled mostly over open ground and lifted 3 miles east of the Peterson farm. By any sensible accounting, they had been fortunate. Fortune can still leave you standing in rain where your barn used to be. Caleb Foster arrived first in a pickup with his wife Marcy and their teenage son Noah. The county hadn't cleared the road, so Caleb had come across the field in four-wheel drive, cutting around downed power lines and a cottonwood laid across the ditch. He got out before the truck stopped moving and put both hands on Howard's shoulders. "You two all right?" Howard said they were. June said the same thing, because saying it twice made it more true. Marcy wrapped June in a dry coat and took her inside while Caleb and Noah started stretching temporary wire across the gap where the south fence had been. By sunset, there were 7 trucks in the yard. The volunteer fire chief checked the propane tank and shut the valve. A deputy photographed the damage for the county report. Someone brought a generator, somebody else brought tarps, and June's niece arrived with a hotel reservation that June refused until rain began dripping through the bedroom ceiling. Howard stayed until Caleb took the work gloves out of his hands. "There's nothing to do in the dark that won't still need doing at daylight," Caleb said. Howard looked past him at the bare slab and said, "My dad's name was on that door." Caleb didn't tell him it was only pencil. He didn't say they could write it again. He stood beside him in the rain and looked at the place where the door had been, which was exactly the right thing. The next morning made the loss look larger. Metal roofing lay wrapped around a utility pole half a mile away. A hay spear had gone through the side of the equipment shed and stopped inches from Howard's tractor. Boards from the loft were scattered over 40 acres, and one of June's blue canning jars sat unbroken in a furrow where no jar had any business being. The insurance adjuster called before noon. The policy would cover part of the house repairs and the actual cash value of the barn, less depreciation, a phrase that meant the building was valuable to Howard and nearly worthless on paper. The number he heard would pay for cleanup and perhaps a basic pole shelter, but not the barn they had lost. Howard thanked the adjuster. He wrote the claim number on the back of an envelope. Then he sat at the kitchen table in a room open to the wet green smell of broken cottonwood and said, "We're done." June knew what he meant. Not dead, not ruined, but done farming in the particular way that had ordered their mornings for more than half a century. Sell the cows. Lease the whole place. Let somebody younger carry what the wind had set down. She put coffee in front of him, though the power was still out, and she'd made it on a camp stove. "We don't decide that today," she said. "Building costs what it costs. I'm not borrowing at 78. "Then we don't borrow." "June," she looked through the missing breakfast window at a yard full of debris. "I said we don't decide today. I did not say the barn will grow back overnight." By late Friday, the immediate work was under control. The cows had been moved to Caleb's pasture, the house was tarped, and a roll-off dumpster stood by the lane. Church members had brought so much food that June had no refrigerator space and no electricity with which to cool it. People came and went. They carried boards, swept glass, refilled coffee, and said variations of the same 3 sentences. "Terrible thing. Could have been worse. Call if you need anything." Howard thanked each one and watched the west side of the yard get emptier. At 6, Walt Mercer from Mercer's Farm and Home drove in with a flatbed trailer. Walt was 63 and wore a pencil behind his ear even when he was asleep, according to his wife. On the trailer were temporary corral panels and enough posts to hold the cows near the machine shed. Howard told him he hadn't ordered them. "I know," Walt said. "They're loaners. Bring them back when you've got a fence." "What's the rate?" "Rate is you stop asking me questions while I've got daylight." Howard helped unload, because accepting a loan was easier than accepting a gift. June watched from the porch and saw what Walt was doing. She also saw him glance once at the empty slab, measure it with his eyes, and make a note on the pad in his shirt pocket. That night the Petersons slept in their own house, beneath blue tarps that snapped whenever the wind changed. Howard woke at 2 and went to the kitchen. June found him there in the dark, barefoot, looking out at the security light shining on nothing. "You remember the first barn raising?" she asked. He nodded. His father had called cousins from 3 counties. Women had served ham sandwiches from card tables, children had carried nails and coffee cans, and the walls had been standing before sunset on the second day. That was how people built when labor was shared because nobody had much cash. "Different time," Howard said. June leaned against the counter beside him. "People still have hands." Saturday arrived clear and cool. At 6:15, Howard heard a diesel engine and assumed Caleb had come for the remaining hay. Then he heard a second engine, and a third, and the long hydraulic whine of a trailer jack. He opened the mudroom door in his slippers. Trucks were turning into the lane. Not 7 this time. A line of them stretched from the house to the county road. Pickups, stock trailers, contractor vans, 2 tractors, a skid steer, and the church bus with pots visible through the windows. Headlights moved through the pale dawn like a slow parade nobody had advertised. Walt Mercer climbed out of the first truck with his pencil behind his ear and a clipboard in his hand. Beside him was Kelsey Grant, a contractor from town whose crew built machine sheds and small commercial buildings. She wore a tool belt over an old college sweatshirt and had already divided the empty slab into chalk marks. Howard came down the porch steps. "What is this?" Walt looked at the clipboard. "Saturday." "Walt, you said you weren't borrowing." Nobody said anything about borrowing. Howard looked from the lumber on the flatbeds to the people climbing out of trucks. There were neighbors he knew well, people he knew by sight, and teenagers he'd only seen carrying trays at the diner. Men from the co-op, women from the bank, the science teacher, 2 off-duty deputies, the dentist and his hygienist, both in work gloves. "I can't pay for this," Howard said. Kelsey stepped over with a roll of plans. "Insurance pays for the slab repairs and part of the materials. The county emergency fund has pledged another piece. Walt has somehow lost track of what the rest of the lumber costs. My crew donated a weekend. I adapted one of our standard engineered plans last night, and the county inspector met me here before sunrise. Everybody else signed a waiver and brought their own gloves. You're not hiring anybody. You're just in the way." From behind her, Walt said, "Accurate." Howard's face changed. June, watching from the porch, saw the stubborn argument rise in him and saw something else rise behind it, something softer and more frightening. He looked down the line of trucks again. Caleb came up beside him. "Let us hold this one, Howard." That did it. Howard took off his cap and pressed the brim flat between both hands. For several seconds he couldn't speak. Nobody filled the silence for him, which was another kindness. Then he put the cap back on and said, "The west corner needs another drain. Old one always held water." Kelsey handed him the plans. "That's why you're quality control." By 7, the slab was swept and snapped with chalk lines. By 8, the first posts stood plumb. The air filled with the practical music of a job underway. Saws, impact drivers, hammers, and names called across open space. There were rules. Kelsey made them clear. No child inside the work zone. No ladder without a spotter. No improvising structural changes because somebody's grandfather had done it that way. Every volunteer signed in. Experienced crews handled the posts, trusses, and roof panels, while everyone else sorted hardware, carried blocking, cleared debris, and kept water moving. This wasn't the old photograph version of a barn raising, where courage substituted for safety. It was a permitted agricultural building engineered for the county's wind load, with licensed people supervising the parts that mattered. Kindness had brought tools, not foolishness. June's operation was the meal line. The church bus had unloaded folding tables beneath 3 canopies, and by 10, the tables held roasters of pulled pork, potato salad in nested bowls of ice, baked beans, fruit, cookies, and 7 kinds of casserole. Nobody could identify the owner of one slow cooker, though it returned every hour freshly filled. Teenagers carried water to the crews and wrote names on paper cups. Noah Foster ran hardware from Walt's store and came back each time with more than the list requested. When Howard asked about an invoice, Noah said Walt had told him the register was acting funny. "All day?" Howard asked. "Might be serious," Noah said, and kept walking. At noon, 4 walls stood. The new barn was smaller than the old one and built of red metal rather than painted wood, but Kelsey had kept the same roofline. She had also drawn a real hayloft into one end after Caleb told her about the carpenter's pencil signature. Howard noticed that detail and looked away before anybody could watch him notice. The county road became a parking lot. People worked in shifts, and those leaving waved to those arriving. By late afternoon, nearly 100 names had appeared on the sign-in sheets, not counting children and the women who had begun cooking before dawn. The midpoint of the day came with a sound that stopped every hammer. Thunder. One low roll moved out of the west. Everyone looked toward a line of dark cloud above the wheat, and for a few seconds, the entire cheerful worksite remembered Thursday. June was carrying a tray of cups. She stopped so suddenly, water ran over her hand. Howard crossed the yard to her without thinking and stood close enough that their shoulders touched. Kelsey checked the radar on her phone. "No rotation, just a fast rain. We clear the roof and ladders now, take lunch under cover, and wait it out." Nobody argued. Tools came down, volunteers moved into the machine shed and church bus, while rain crossed the farm in a silver sheet, drumming on the one roof the tornado had spared. That half hour mattered more than anyone understood at the time. Work had kept Howard moving since dawn, but rain took the tools out of his hands. He sat on an overturned bucket with Caleb beside him and watched water darken the new posts. "Your dad built the old one," Caleb said. Howard nodded. "You think this means it's not his anymore?" Howard rubbed sawdust between his fingers. "I think I had one job. Keep what he left me." Caleb considered that. "My dad left me debt and a truck that pulled right. You helped me buy my first heifers anyway. Was that his farm or yours?" Howard didn't answer. Caleb pointed through the rain at Noah, who was showing 2 younger children how to sort bolts by length. "Maybe keeping a thing isn't the same as keeping the lumber." The shower moved east. Sunlight reached under the clouds and turned every drop on the posts bright. Kelsey checked the site, declared the ladders safe again, and the hammers resumed. By dusk, the trusses were up. Floodlights ran from generators after dark, but Kelsey called the elevated work before fatigue made anybody careless. The first roof panels waited in neat stacks for morning. People ate at folding tables in the new barn's open frame, looking through red posts at stars the storm had polished clean. June sat beside Howard on a pair of feed sacks. Across from them, Arlene Price, who had taught both their children in 2nd grade and was now 81, put half a biscuit in a napkin for later and said, "Looks like a barn." Howard said, "Looks like sticks." Arlene chewed thoughtfully. "You looked like sticks at 20. June kept you." June laughed so hard she had to put down her coffee. Sunday started with biscuits and ended with doors. The roofing crew went up at first light. Electricians ran safe conduit while volunteers fastened lower wall panels. Caleb set gates. Noah painted the loft rail. June walked the slab collecting bent nails in a coffee can, the same job she'd had at the first barn raising 56 years before. At 3 in the afternoon, Kelsey swung the last main door into place. It rolled cleanly along its track and closed with a solid, settling sound. The crowd applauded, not wildly, but with the tired satisfaction of people who had made a plan visible. Then Walt brought out a carpenter's pencil. He handed it to Howard and pointed at the inside of the door. Howard shook his head. "Wasn't just me." "Exactly," Walt said. Someone produced a marker instead, a black permanent one with a broad tip. Howard wrote his father's initials first, copying them from an old photograph June had found in a drawer after the storm. Under those letters, he wrote his own name and June's. Then he handed the marker to Caleb. The marker traveled. Kelsey signed beside her crew. Walt wrote the hardware store's name and added that all sales were final. Noah signed in letters too large for the space he chose. The dentist, the deputies, the church cooks, the teenagers, the bank teller, the fire chief, and everyone still on the farm found room somewhere inside that door. People who had already gone home were added from the sign-in sheets in June's careful handwriting. She counted the names that evening. There were 107. At the bottom, Cole Mercer, Walt's 8-year-old grandson, printed a sentence after asking his grandfather how to spell every word. "This barn belongs to everybody who comes back." Nobody corrected him. Nobody wanted to. The cows came home Monday morning. They entered the new barn with none of the reverence people had shown, inspected the clean water trough, and immediately began rubbing mud against a red wall panel. Howard stood with his hands on his hips and said the place finally looked inhabited. Insurance paperwork continued for months. The house roof took until August. Howard and June paid what they could, accepted what had been freely given, and kept a notebook listing every hour, meal, board, and borrowed tool. Not because anyone asked for repayment, but because gratitude, like grief, needs somewhere practical to go. Howard did not sell the cows. He did lease another field to Caleb because the storm had taught him the difference between surrendering and making room. He kept the 6 cows, the garden, and the morning thermos. The new barn held hay, tools, and one framed photograph of the old carpenter's pencil initials. Here's what happened next. The following May, storm season returned. Weather radios came off shelves, June restocked the cellar, Howard checked the generator, and every low cloud made them both look west a little longer than before. Healing did not make them forget what a roar sounded like. It taught them what to do with the memory. On the Tuesday evening, a smaller tornado touched down 2 farms east. It missed the house of a young couple named Ben and Lucy Carter, but it peeled the roof from their machine shed, scattered fencing, and overturned the trailer where they kept feed for a small herd of goats. Howard heard the address over the fire scanner. He was already reaching for his boots when June came from the pantry carrying the big aluminum roaster. "Chili or pulled pork?" she asked. "Chili travels better." They didn't discuss whether they were going. Some decisions, once made for you, become part of the house. By daylight Wednesday, the Carter goats were in spare pens behind the Peterson barn. Howard had called Kelsey. June had called the church cooks. Walt, whose register had apparently never recovered, had begun losing track of lumber again. The rebuild was smaller and took one long Saturday. There were fewer trucks because the damage was lighter, but the shape of the day was the same. Chalk lines at dawn, water moving through the crews, a meal beneath canopies, children sorting bolts where they could be safely watched. At supper, Lucy Carter tried to thank everybody and couldn't finish. June took the paper plate out of her shaking hands and said, "You don't owe us. We're not paying you back. We're passing it on. Those are different books." Howard heard her and smiled into his coffee. Before dark, he took the black marker from his shirt pocket and drew a small line on the inside of the Carter shed door. Then he signed his name below it and handed the marker to Lucy. That became the custom. There are now 5 rebuilt doors in that county with names written on the inside. Storm doors, fire doors, one door from a machine shed that collapsed beneath ice. Howard and June's signatures are on 4 of them. The 5th is their own, where 107 names have faded slightly in the heat, but remain readable when the afternoon light comes through. Howard is 80 now. He moves more slowly and allows Noah to climb the loft ladder, which may be the greatest concession age has won from him. June still plants too many tomatoes and sends the extras home in cardboard boxes with anyone who enters the yard. The old blue canning jar that survived the tornado sits on their kitchen windows. June never uses it. In summer, she puts wildflowers in it, and in winter, it catches the low western sun and throws a blue patch of light across the table where Howard once sat and said they were done. They weren't done. They were standing in the pause between losing a thing and learning what could replace it. The barn the tornado took had belonged to Howard's father. The barn that stands there now belongs, in some small, unrecorded way, to a county. It belongs to the hands that raised it, to the casseroles nobody could identify, To the teenagers who carried water, to the contractor who kept everyone safe, and to a hardware store register that developed a highly selective memory for one weekend. And late in the day, when the sun comes through the open main door, it lands on all those names. Howard sometimes stands there after feeding and runs one finger beneath his father's copied initials, then beneath his own, then along the crowded rows below. He no longer thinks keeping a thing means preserving every board exactly as it was. A barn can be timber and metal, but it can also be a promise people make with their hands. If the wind takes your place in the world, we will come on Saturday and help you build another. So sleep well tonight. Let the weather move far beyond your window, and let the room be quiet again. Somewhere on a Kansas farm, 6 cows are breathing in a red barn. One old hound from the Carter place is asleep beneath the feed table, and 107 names are safe inside a door. If this story kept you company, you can leave a like and subscribe for the next one. And before you go, tell me this. If your neighbors arrived with lumber and wouldn't take no for an answer, would you accept the help, or would pride make you send them home? Share your state and age, too. I always like knowing where these stories find you. Sleep well. I'll see you in the next one.